Hey, this is Chris. Just a quick reminder that you can find us on Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, rate, and review us there. That would be great and an immense help to us as we try and promote the podcast. You can also visit us online at blasphemypodcast.com. You can get to know Marnie and myself there. You can also get in touch with us, and we'd love to hear from you. So just wanted to get that out of the way. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, all the places you find podcast shit. So let's take a look at part 3 of the Satanic Panic around Dungeons and Dragons. If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that humans will believe almost anything. On Blasphemy with Chris and Marnie, we take a look at some of these beliefs, uncover their very human origins, how they've developed and changed over time, and the very real consequences they had in society and culture. Impacts that continue even today in our lives. Welcome to Blasphemy. My name is Chris Setti, and sitting all cozy under a bunch of blankets because it's freezing cold here is my wife Marnie.
Hi. So I never know if you're going to like leave it blank for me to say my name, or if you're going to say my name and I'm supposed to just say hi.
Yeah.
And so I'm like hanging on the edge of my seat and have this awkward moment where I come in because I wasn't prepared.
We would not be a good improv team. Not a lot of yes-anding happening. But tonight we're going to complete our series that we're going through regarding Dungeons and Dragons and the moral panic that evolved around that in the 80s and 90s. A panic that started, make sure you listen to episode 1 and you can see what ignited that whole thing. But it started with a tragic event and was, in the second episode, we talked about the real magical thinkers that kind of came on the scene and started kind of doing their little stuff. Mostly evangelical Christians coming with all kinds of grifts and stories and things. But tonight, I want to conclude it by looking at more of the moral panic at large. Like, yes, there were people that, were very radical and kind of, coming at it from a very religious standpoint. But then there was also, at this time in the 80s, especially, this is when stickers showed up on our albums that said explicit lyrics. Remember that?
Yeah.
And that was driven by...
We were older.
I guess it was in the 90s, late
90s.
80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
That was from the PMRC, the Parental Music Resource Center.
Mm-hmm.
Such an innocuous name for something that was violating our First Amendment rights. But it was, it had people like Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife on it, who was vice president at the time. And so Tipper Gore, the vice president's wife, was on this. And this was a time when Twisted Sister came and, testified before Congress trying to fight this idea. Now, of course, it all backfired. As soon as you put that explicit lyrics thing on the thing, everyone wanted it. I did. I was like, I'm not buying shit unless there's this warning label on it. I'm sorry. So just like the, just say no thing that Nancy Reagan did right before all of this stuff, all it did was really push more rebellion, but because we're humans. But there was a more moral, what would I call it? Like societal crusades going on also that didn't necessarily have that Christian edge. They weren't trying to evangelize anyone. They weren't trying to, it still talked about Satan and stuff, which was weird, which was this weird blurring of lines. But they were trying to get change made in real society. They didn't care if you thought it was Satan or not. If you thought it was dangerous, you were on their team. And they really, really were trying to get stuff banned or labeled as dangerous, things like that.
Isn't that just because the dominant religion in America is Christian, and even those that don't follow it probably were raised in it and left it, or just were raised in a community that all of the ideas around them were in it. And so they didn't necessarily, even if they didn't call it Christianity, it was informed and influenced by it. And especially in the 80s, it was a reaction to the 60s and 70s and trying to rein it all back in because they were
True.
like, whoa, you guys got a little crazy. And it was the adults, it was the hippies that became adults.
Yeah, they
and
grew
a
up,
bunch of them,
put
like
on
some of them
suits.
stayed hippies, but some of them went all uptight, freaked out that they had gone so far out, and then came rushing back to their moralism. And went back to their roots because they freaked themselves out with how far they went, or things were new and kind of radical and crazy and not well thought out.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of them became the yuppies, right? They did. At least the tail end of the hippies. A lot of those people put on suits and became good capitalists, people in an age when that was being celebrated and everything like that. But yeah, you're right. There's a dominance. Obviously, there's a Judeo-Christian dominance in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. And we'll talk a little bit about this because the main person, the main character in this moral crusade that was happening not in churches and things, but on national TV, in police stations, in, newspaper articles and all around, media out there in the open. It wasn't like, let's watch Praise the Lord and watch this guy rant about, Dungeons and Dragons. That's a limited audience.
Yep.
She was out there trying to make big change, and she actually wasn't a Christian, but she was still, that Satan thing was still there because that Satan mythology, that Christian idea of Satan, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. But yeah, it's just this prevailing idea that we're kind of inoculated with it, right? Is that the right word? Inoculated with it. That's what I meant. We're all kind of like enter into our society with a shot of kind of Judeo-Christian mythology and kind of ethos. What we consider good is largely based off of ideas of the Ten Commandments or things that Jesus
I question
said.
everything that I think is good. I
Yeah,
ask myself deep questions
Yeah.
of where my morality has come from and find better answers.
Yeah, that's why I love outfits like the Satanic Temple, who are like, oh, you want to put up the thing of the Ten Commandments at this courthouse? Cool. That's awesome. Let's celebrate our religious diversity. We so happen to have a monument that we want to put up in there too, and it's a big statue of Baphomet.
Yes.
And children running and dancing and singing on his lap. It's very wild.
That's
but
my favorite commandment from that place, that book. Be careful of all. What's my favorite?
oh, it says that he that is slow to believe anything and everything is wise, because belief in one false principle leads to all undoing, or something like that.
It's really good, and
Yeah.
it's my favorite.
Well, I mean, we're talking about the Satanic Panic, just so you know. I'm preparing we'll have a whole bunch of different episodes around the concept of Satan. I know that Christianity thinks they have the idea of Satan and that they came up with him and that they kind of control the narrative, but that's just because, like you said, culturally.
They think they came up with everything.
I know, but it's actually a fascinating look into, just the nature of the human experience and being a conscious being in a confusing world that we've made infinitely more confusing. And confronting things like the nature of evil and where, and even reaching far back to where more primitive understandings of light and dark and night and day and things, and death and life and the idea of this enemy or this thing to beware of, this adversary is definitely something that we developed along the way. And the Satan we have in America that's based off of the Christian devil is just one permutation that's existed. And it's not even the 600 years ago, Christian Satan was different than now. Satan isn't this thing that Jesus talked about and sat down and drew a picture of this red character with a pointy tail, and horns. That evolved over time, mostly, by the way, by mentally ill artists who largely informed the mythology and ideas around hell and Satan that the church adopted over time. It was mostly artists that framed our picture as whether they're taking drugs or they're, or maybe they were just like dipping deep into their subconscious, but they painted these scenes that morphed and evolved our idea of hell.
Mm-hmm.
But it has not been the same.
Yeah.
And the idea that you think you're believing the hell that they talked about in like 1st century AD or something, they weren't talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the devil wasn't even someone that they even cared about or even was a concept that the church talked about for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And yet now
It's a given.
it's like the central character in Christianity.
Yeah.
Jesus isn't even really fucking the star. No one gives a shit about Jesus. No one's trying to imitate Jesus.
No.
They're just trying to fight the devil, and the way they fight the
Yeah.
devil is by going like, we got to do exactly like he does.
Yeah.
So they're all doing evil shit in the name of like, well, the devil will just do it to us if we. I mean, that's their rationale. It's
Yeah.
fucking nuts,
Oof.
right? But anyway, that's my rant on Satan. We'll get to the devil, and I have a lot to say about the devil. It's a fascinating look again at the human, what it is to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And not, some real kind of thing. But let's get into our final chapter of the moral panic around Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
So while the tragic events of Dallas Egbert's disappearance and subsequent suicide was the spark that ignited the moral concern around Dungeons and Dragons, the mainstream thrust of the movement would be ignited by another teenage boy's suicide in 1982. His name was Irving Pulling, but everyone called him Bink. So, in episode 1, again, we saw how this whole thing started with a very special, at-risk, you could say, kid. Remember, he was like the 16-year-old kid. He was gay. He's thrust into this adult world of university in a time when there wasn't that wasn't a common thing, and there wasn't any resources set up for him. He turned to hardcore drugs, wound up multiple times trying to kill himself. And remember, he disappears in 1979, and the private investigator that gets hired to investigate the case weaves this fantastical tale based off of, what he considers evidence was just Dungeons and Dragons materials in his room. He didn't seem to be an avid player. No one could even remember playing with him while he was there. But the private investigator, who saw himself as kind of a cowboy, like a hero coming in to save the day, he weaves this tale that gets, inflated and escalated by the media.
Yeah, that story was super infuriating.
Yeah.
And frustrating to hear about in episode 1, our very first episode that we ever recorded.
Yeah, I know. When you listen to some of these, you're like, oh, God, they sound different.
Their
or like,
audio
they sucked on that one. It's because that was the very first episode we did was episode 1.
So you need to listen to it because it's really good information and just a really interesting, heartbreaking story, but the audio sucks.
Yeah.
And we
still learning.
didn't re-record it because I don't have the information. He's researching. I don't know it. And so I'm learning about it the first time. We found that when we try to re-record, I end up talking over him, speaking ahead because now I know the story.
Yeah.
And
Just
it's
beat
not
me to the punch constantly.
it's difficult and strained and weird.
Yeah.
So we didn't re-record it. We're just like, deal with the bad audio on that one. We'll move forward.
It's better when you're totally naive to the whole thing. But anyway, remember that private investigator, he's out there in the media saying, I think it has something to do with Dungeons and Dragons, and there's this dungeon master that he must have fallen prey to, like some cultic thing. And remember, this guy was kind of like, he'd become famous by rescuing these hippies, again, coming out of in the 70s that were joining cults and winding up in trouble, and their parents were hiring this guy. And, of course, he finds him safe and sound, and anyway, that got the ball rolling, right? And a year later, he killed himself. And he didn't kill himself based on Dungeons & Dragons or anything else. He killed himself on all the issues that caused him to disappear in the first place. He was trying to kill himself. He failed, so he ran.
Yeah, he had his whole story going on, his whole issues.
It's crazy.
And they were his, and they were separate, and they just fucking grabbed hold and made up this whole fantasy about what was really going on with him. It's super
Yeah. Hijacked the tragedy of this kid. And it really got the thing rolling. And as we saw in episode 2, as the Christian evangelical church response is going, that's the thing that got them going. The first thing that the guy brought up, what was his name? Albert Dager, the guy who first kind of brought up Dungeons and Dragons as a concern for Christians. He said it played a role in the disappearance and subsequent suicide of James Dallas Egbert. And so it absolutely was a thing that got going. Now, when it comes to no one in Dallas's family got involved in like fighting Dungeons and Dragons though out in culture.
Yeah.
You don't hear from his parents, but you don't hear about his parents in any of it, which is wild. But you don't hear from his parents. You don't see them start a crusade.
Yeah, like when you say the story was hijacked, it literally was hijacked away from
Oh,
the
yeah.
actual people involved in the story.
Had nothing to do with James anymore either.
It's crazy.
It only had to do with what people could capitalize on, which
Yeah.
we saw was a book by William Deere, and then
Mhm.
Mazes and Monsters. Remember the book, and then the TV movie that came out, all capitalizing on this kid's death, spinning it out of control into this weird tale of fantasy,
Yeah.
instead of looking at what really went wrong and how could we fucking change, how could we keep this from happening again. It's kind of sad. But in 1982, there's another suicide, right? So this is 2 years after James kills himself. He
Mhm.
disappears in 79, kills himself in 80.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1982, a kid named Irving Pulling, he went by Bink.
Oh,
All his friends
yeah.
called him Bink. His family called him Bink, so we're going to refer to him as that. Interesting, they all have nicknames.
They do. They have okay.
Like James went by Dallas, and then this guy went by Bink. I don't know. I was never given a nickname.
I know.
I didn't, they called me
either.
by the name they gave me.
Yeah.
But anyway, Bink had a mom named Patricia, and it was she who would lead the charge to defeat satanic forces that were at work all around us, forces that had clearly gotten to her son. On June 9th, 1982, Patricia Pulling and her husband arrived back home. As they pulled into their driveway, they saw the bloody body of their 16-year-old son. Next to him, on the ground, laid Patricia's personal .38 caliber revolver, with which Bink had shot himself in the chest. He had done so in the front doorway, presumably so his body would be the first thing his parents saw when they arrived home. Gnarly. Like her and her husband, imagine coming home, they
Yeah.
pull in their driveway, and there's their teenage son laying literally in the doorway. He had shot himself with his mom's gun. Apparently there were multiple guns. He chose that one. So, you know, there seems to be a lot of symbolism happening
Yeah.
here. Like kids, I was a paramedic. I actually saw quite a few like suicides and things like that.
Yeah.
They tended to do it away from where people would discover that there was almost this kind of like, you know, regret that someone
would
else
have
was
to
going to have
find
to
them.
find
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Even if they're like, I'm checking out, I can't deal with this anymore, there was still that kind of like concern
Mhm.
about the people left behind. And so in this case, it was like the intention seemed to be sending a little bit of a message,
Yeah.
kind of, right? And something maybe we don't really get is that teenage suicide at this time was out of control, right?
Mm.
It was very high.
Mm.
Today, we live in a world where when we hear of, we have a lot of if you're a YouTube star or TikTok star, apparently you're just offing yourself like crazy. There's been a lot of those dying
Well,
this year.
but statistically, actually, I think men senior age 70 and like 60s and over are the highest range of
Right.
suicide. Not
Right.
we think of teenagers as the people that kill themselves.
Right. And I think that was cemented from this time when it was kind of rampant.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of teenage suicide.
Yeah.
Now, like you said, it's when you hear about that, you're like, oh my God, it's so young. You know, then it was like there was concern,
Yeah.
right? There were a lot of programs happening in schools, and there were a lot of like TV and the media kind of attempts to address this. And you start seeing messages of, if you're struggling, reach out. And you start hearing like the suicide hotline was founded at this time, and
Mm-hmm.
because so much of it was going on. And so it was in the ethos,
Yeah.
right? This wasn't an anomaly. This was something that happened far too often from the standpoint of the populace who was just seeing this in the media and things like that. She claims that after the police arrived, they took her aside and asked her if her family worships the devil. Wild. The cops, this is what she says, by the way. So I don't know
Yeah.
if the cops did, but this was her story, is that they pulled her aside and say like, hey, do you guys worship the devil? First of all, who says like, yeah, of course, hail Satan. You know, like, do you? But that's what she says they asked him. This question, she says, was based on materials that Bink had in his room. Okay. So apparently, you know, they had found some things that we'll get to what they found, and they found some Dungeons and Dragons materials and things, but which led the cops, who at this time were on high alert for all this stuff that Patricia Pulling is going to become very involved in. Um, and again, I don't know if she didn't reverse engineer this and insert this into the narrative
Yeah.
later to
Yeah.
make it, because she needed an origin story, and this would have been it.
Yeah.
I mean, as we'll see, this is just a human drama playing out in someone. In fact, let me read a quote to you. So this is actually a quote from Patricia Pulling. Okay, that's Bink's mom. Remember, this is the kid that killed himself.
Yeah.
His mom, Patricia. This is a quote from her. Quote, "I did not feel the same as I have heard that so many families do when there has been a suicide, but I did feel extreme pain and, to some degree, anger. Yes, anger. Anger that I had not known what was going on in my son's mind. Anger and guilt that I must have lacked something that would have allowed me to know that I had a child in trouble. I did not feel that Lee and I were to blame in any way for what had happened, but I wondered why we hadn't seen that something was very wrong. What could have caused our son to become so disturbed, and how did it happen so suddenly? Had I not been paying attention?" Now you can see, she kind of gives away the plot a little bit in that quote, in that she's like, I didn't feel blame or guilt like a lot of people do, which to me indicates she did. And this was just a huge attempt to offload that, to scapegoat it, right? Because that really does help us. We've talked about that, like how scapegoating is not, it was a ritual that we did, in like the Old Testament, obviously, the whole idea of scapegoating things. But there is kind of a ritualistic offloading of energy, you could say, that you're carrying.
Yeah.
Guilt, shame, questions, stress, pressure. And so I understand what she's doing, right? Unfortunately, she does it on a stage that literally like unfortunately demonizes things that shouldn't be, and it causes some confusion and craziness in parts of our society that are supposed to be places that are safe from that and like more rational, and so it gets a little crazy. So Bink was clearly dealing with something intense and troubling, because the cops apparently did find writings and material that she referred to as sadistic poetry. Okay, so they found some materials in Bink's room, and a lot of this is coming from Patricia later in her writings, in her interviews, in her books that she would write and things like that.
Do we have information apart from Patricia
About
Binks?
Yeah, we'll get some information from other sources here coming up.
Okay.
So Bink left behind a suicide note. So I want to quote from Joseph Laycock's Dangerous Games around the suicide note. He says, although Pulling never revealed the exact contents of the note, she stated that in it, quote, he equated himself with Adolf Hitler and the Antichrist, and said he had been summoned to commit murder, couldn't bring himself to hurt anyone else, and so must end his own life to rid the world of this evil. Okay, so if this is true, again, this is Patricia, which it's hard because she's definitely committed and like selling something. She's biased, And so I don't know. These things are all being sourced from her. But the idea was, as we'll see, a narrative does seem to kind of leak out, even if you have to read between the lines or seek underneath, that something was going on with Bink. Not Satan or Dungeons and Dragons, but...
Are you going to tell us?
Something... Well, I mean, we don't know. He fucking shot himself in the chest. But based on the evidence, based off of some testimony and some things that people say from around, it seems like he was starting to manifest some pretty serious psychological issues that were going ignored.
Are you going to tell us what those were?
We don't know what they were because he shot himself. They never got diagnosed, but I am going to tell you some of the things that were said about him leading up to this event.
That's what
that were outside of Patricia Pulling.
I want to know things outside of Patricia.
Right. I know that. So this kid was struggling with some form of emerging mental illness. In all likelihood, at the very least, he needed to talk to someone.
Because my thoughts are, your dog and his mom right now, and she's just lost her son, and I seem to recall that there's reason, but you haven't divulged that. So
I'm dogging her not because I also
I feel like you have information that is making you dog her
I
that we don't have, and so then we're going to be like defensive of her because you're not
right.
getting to it yet.
If she would have gone out and that would have happened, and then it would kind of blown her wad, and then she would have got real introspective and been like, "Damn," and like faded away and kind of dealt with it, or maybe went to a therapist and talked it out and kind of dealt with it. That'd have been one thing. She goes the other way into a full-blown moral crusade that poisoned our society in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that was her intent. It clearly was not. But she got on one. And her dealing with this psychological damage and the loss of her son and all the things going on, unfortunately had impacts in our society that impacted a lot of other people. Also, amongst his possessions, she found a D&D manual with a piece of paper folded inside. On it was written, "Your soul is mine. I choose the time. At my command, you will leave the land. A follower of evil, killer of man." Apparently, this was a prop used by the dungeon master, an English teacher at a school, during a game Bink had participated in. The poem served as an imaginative way to introduce the plot of the campaign. Bink's character was cursed with lycanthropy. You know what that is? Turning into a werewolf, And the other players had to figure out how to lift the curse before he changed. But Patricia grabbed a hold of this poem as proof that Bink had killed himself due to Dungeons and Dragons. Quote, "When my son died and I saw the death curse that had been given to him, I thought that surely no one would take such a curse seriously. Surely no one would follow a command to commit suicide. Then I began to think about the 900 plus people of Jonestown who committed suicide at the command of a deranged leader named Jim Jones." That's a huge false equivalency, by the way. Jim Jones was a cult leader who literally programmed and brainwashed a group of people over a very long process. Using very classic techniques of breaking people down and getting them to a point where they would do something like commit ritual suicide, to mass suicide together.
Yeah.
Playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons at your school with your English teacher and friends is fucking not the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's already wild and crazy, and you're just trying to that's hard to deal with, right? In reality, Bink had been showing signs of extreme psychological stress and issues for some time. He was clearly socially disaffected and depressed. From a 1983 Washington Post article on the suicide, quote, "Bink Pulling had trouble fitting in and became dejected when he was unable to find a campaign manager when he ran for school office. Shortly before his death, he wrote, 'Life is a joke' on the blackboard in one of his classes," one classmate said. So as they began, the book, the Joseph Laycock's book, he talked to quite a few of the students that knew Bink.
Yeah.
Kids that played with him, administrators at the school, principals, all kinds of people.
Mm-hmm.
And, it kind of became clear as they're, putting these pieces together that people had already begun noticing, like, Bink's weird. Something's up with him. He wanted to run for office, but the rule was you couldn't run for office unless you could find someone to be your campaign manager, which literally is nothing more than just write your name here, you're my campaign manager.
Mm-hmm.
And he couldn't find anyone who would agree to do it.
That's sad.
Yeah, super sad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's an outcast.
I feel like we've evolved some in that there used to be a much narrower view of quote unquote normal and acceptable, and you could easily be more ostracized than
Yeah.
And I guess that's also geographically depends on where you're at too.
Yeah, and there was a different vibe then, right? Like if you think about now, we're all so connected that we're all on a search to differentiate ourselves.
Yeah.
And back then we were also disconnected, or we were so localized that we were trying to find a way to like
fit
into the greater, bigger picture. So there was kind of a different,
That's interesting. Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
now it's like
totally.
you search for like this little community you can belong to because you're part of this fucking global,
Yeah.
Back then it was like, I want to matter in the world. I only, I
And
don't.
the world is small, like your little local
Yeah,
environment. That was
yeah,
the world you had to fit in.
definitely. So, even more details provided by Patricia Pulling herself during a law enforcement seminar, a transcript of which was obtained by Robert Hicks. So, Robert Hicks wrote a book called In Pursuit of Satan. It was another of the books I read in preparation for that. And he was a journalist who was a crime journalist. He also covered, the police and things. So, he had a lot of inroads into the law enforcement community.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a book. Like I said, called In Pursuit of Satan. I think it's called The Police and the Occult. And it was basically about this phenomenon of how cops became these Satan hunters. And we'll talk about,
weird.
but she did it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We're going to find out. Patricia Pulling did this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's what it says in Pursuit of Satan. Pulling stated then, but not in any of her publications or subsequent interviews, that several weeks before his death, her son had been displaying lycanthropic tendencies such as running around the backyard on all fours and barking. Pulling was also quoted as saying that, within the month before her son's death, 19 rabbits he had raised were inexplicably torn apart, although no loose dogs were seen, and a cat was found disemboweled with a knife. So I read some information out there. There is some evidence that the police did look into this, and they did have evidence that pointed to Bink being the one who did this. And when you have kids torturing animals,
Yeah, you go sociopath.
a sign of some dark shit.
Yeah, psychopath.
It's not a sign that they were cursed with being a werewolf
No.
in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
It's other stuff, and I think that she again is throwing some shit in there to make it. He's running around on
And I don't
fours.
think
Was
they-
he? I don't know if he was, but
Right.
it would make a lot more sense if she was trying to tie this to the D&D curse.
I don't recall that they knew that back then. The torture of animals was a
Yeah, that's a good question.
sign of
that whole triad of
psychopathy.
like, what is it? It's like bedwetting and hurting animals.
Mhm.
What's the other one?
I don't remember.
I don't remember yet. Anyway, it's that whole idea that there's this kind of these
It
underlying.
wouldn't have been a common thing that she would know.
No. And again, she's got to make this make sense.
Yeah.
That keeps her out of the blame loop, and so she's got put it on D&D. And what happened in this D&D class? Well, he was told he's a werewolf. Well, and then he killed a bunch of animals. He must have thought he was a werewolf, and then next thing you know, he was running around on all fours. No one could corroborate that, but the animals were dead. I did see evidence that this was a real thing that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some shit going on, obviously. Joseph Laycock, author of Dangerous Games, actually tracked down and interviewed someone who played D&D with Bink and was able to observe him closely prior to his suicide. Quote, according to this source, Bink only played D&D at school for a total of 9 hours, which is nothing for people who play Dungeons and Dragons. In this person's opinion, Bink's suicide had been an act of aggression towards his mother. Both of his parents had been having affairs before this suicide, and Bink knew it. Bink shot himself in the chest with a .38 caliber pistol that belonged to his mother, and his choice to commit suicide on the front porch appeared to be a deliberate attempt to shock and horrify his parents when they returned home. Faced with this possibility, it is little wonder that Pulling chose to believe her son's death was caused entirely by a game he played at school.
Yeah.
So even in talking to, people that went to school with him, they're like, so he was super into D&D, right? And they're like, oh, no. But he did know that his parents were cheating on each other. And he did, these kids are like, I'm not caught up in this idea that magic is real. So here's what I see going on. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can see she's got a very complicated narrative that she's got to like straighten out. And she really does turn that attention towards, I'm going to keep this from happening to anyone else's kid, I guess you could say, is what it becomes a mission.
Yeah.
And if you have a mission, then you don't stop and think about, what happened? You're like, I just got to change things. So first, Patricia filed a lawsuit against the principal of Bink's school, claiming that he should have recognized her son's instability and kept him from such dangerous activities as D&D. It failed, but does reveal that she understood, at least on some level, that something more human was at work leading up to her son's death.
So interesting that she's like, I'm not to blame, but let me blame the principal for
Right,
not noticing that this was
right.
bad for him. But she didn't either. But she's like excluding herself and pointing the finger.
Right, because
there.
that's what this is all an attempt to put it somewhere
Yeah.
else. And notice she said, why didn't he see my son was troubled and keep him from D&D?
Exactly.
Not, he started playing D&D and then he was troubled. So she kind of gives away a little bit of like, things
Gotcha
were
there.
off before the D&D thing hit.
Yeah.
And she's suing the principal for negligence that he should have spotted that and kept him. She's still trying to nail D&D, but she kind of gives away a little bit of that, like
he wasn't mentally stable enough to handle D&D, and you should have kept him from it.
Right. Which again is sad. I'm not fucking laughing at this woman or anything like that. It's just you see the human thing happening here. Meanwhile, we're all like Satan, But I mean, it's just people doing people things. She turned her sights firmly on D&D into a full-blown moral crusade as her narrative around Bink's death continued to evolve into a complex and shadowy satanic plot. Quoting again from Dangerous Games by Joseph Laycock, quote, she eventually arrived at the following theory of her son's suicide. Bink had been brainwashed from playing D&D to the point where he had to literally act out a curse by murdering his own family. The only way that Bink could resist this conditioning and spare his family was by taking his own life. She recast Bink as a heroic figure, making the ultimate sacrifice as he fought the evil forces unleashed by D&D, saving his beloved and innocent family in the process.
Wow.
So she took him from like tragic victim into he fought evil until the end and made the ultimate sacrifice to not do harm to anyone else or to us especially.
Well, she took him from also like he kind of angrily committed suicide in front of them, that would feel like an attack on them. To he was trying to save us, like make him
a sacrificial hero.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty wild. In 1983, Patricia Pulling formed an organization to root out the evils of D&D in American culture. She gave it the most mom name for anything ever. Patricia named the group BAD, which stood for Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Like, it is responsible for her son killing animals and then killing himself. And she's like, this bothers me. I'm bothered. This really bothers me.
This bothers me.
Come on, kids. You're bothering me about this Dungeons and Dragons. It's just fucking so funny. I don't know why that's so funny to me. And it was like obviously ripped off from like Mad Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but it's BADD. Bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. It's the best. It's the best.
I know.
And you can just see them sitting and thinking like, oh, yeah, that's exactly. I am bothered about it. I'm really bothered. Oh, fucking so great. In information disseminated by the group, she would describe D&D as, quote, a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity. I don't know how you use insanity, but it's in there. Sex perversion. That's where you put it in places you're not supposed to. Homosexuality, prostitution, satanic type necromantics, which she made that up. I don't even know what the fuck that means. I'm assuming she means like necromancy. Necromancy is what she means, but satanic type necromantics. That sounds like a fucking like screamo band from like 2002.
Make it
We're the necromantics,
a bad thing
man.
worse. Bad.
It's like sounds like music you'd cut yourself to. The necromantics, divination, and other teachings. Who knows what else is in there? So, like, first of all, she's just throwing shit at the wall.
Yeah.
She doesn't know shit about voodoo, by the way. And I'm sure she knows nothing about witchcraft or, any of that. But just like, these are all words that scare people and are socially unacceptable. So, she's really getting going. Along the way, She would enlist other moral entrepreneurs in her fight. Quoting again from Dangerous Games, quote, Pulling made sense of her son's death by blaming it on an evil game connected to a satanic conspiracy theory. As the leader of bad, she was able to offer others the same tool for constructing meaning out of pain and loss. Not surprisingly, some of her most loyal lieutenants in bad were also bereaved parents. So here's another quote, by the way. This is from In Pursuit of Satan. Quote, at first we blamed ourselves. This is from other parents that kind of joined bad, right, after their kids killed themselves. Quote, at first we blamed ourselves. Then we started learning about similar deaths and seeing the pattern. Slowly we realized we weren't responsible. Yeah. So you can see it's like, I feel bad. Yeah. Oh, wait, what? Yeah. You mean it doesn't have anything to do with me? It's because you played Dungeons and Dragons? And then they were able to
scapegoat.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not to say that they should have felt bad.
No, not at all. I'm not saying that.
No, I know. That's what I'm just clarifying. Like, just because you use a scapegoat doesn't mean that you are guilty. It's just if you feel guilty and you're uncomfortable with that guilt, not removing it constructively, but using a scapegoat to place it someplace else to make you feel better, which is instinctual. Like we seem to, without being conscious, do that.
Yeah.
It takes more awareness and consciousness to go, I feel guilt and shame. Should I feel guilt and shame? Did I do something? If I didn't, then I need to stop feeling that way. If I did, I should look at my...
Deal with that.
Yeah. But they didn't... It's normal that we don't know how to deal with our feelings, so we have all these little manipulations that we do.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. And Patricia Pulling, as we see, I mean, she's impressive to me, first of all. She's not a fucking slacker. Like, there was a lot of parents worked up over shit, but man, she got shit done. Unfortunately, the shit she got done just caused more confusion and chaos, and maybe even fed into an atmosphere that sent innocent people to jail on more occasions than we understand, as people were being thrown in jail because they looked different and must have worshipped Satan, or the kid said that you did satanic stuff to me. So, like she fed into the panic that unfortunately, created all this nonsense.
That's where her behavior pisses me off, where I lose compassion when your ineptitude in dealing with your emotions created harm for other people.
That's the hard part about the story. Is like,
she's a powerful, capable person, so she took her ineptitude in dealing with her emotions and used her strength to be destructive rather than help herself and others.
Yeah. What sucks is if she would have gone like, I'm going to raise awareness about teen suicide, she could have got shit done. Yeah. She clearly, you'll see, she has the will, the energy, and she was not afraid at all to put herself into places she did not belong. Yeah. She did not belong talking to police. She did not belong being on the news or being an expert in anything, but she got her fucking self there. Yeah. If she would have taken on something that actually would have helped with the actual problem, I can imagine she probably could have had an impact. But unfortunately,
she had an impact that was negative.
Yeah, because it was all in myth and fantasy and the shadowy, not real enemy that she was fighting. Just like what we talked about in the adrenochrome thing, right? It's like we get caught up in these fake enemies and then the real thing just keeps happening. So a frequently used piece of evidence by Bad has become known as the trophy list, a list of 15 deaths, mostly suicides, that she linked to Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so now I want to show you. You guys can't see this because it's an audio podcast, but I'm going to show Marnie. She's gonna describe it to you.
I get to see.
But this is the actual cover of Bad paraphernalia here about Dungeons and Dragons. It is 80s glorious. First of all, this is when you.
And it looks more like something that's advertising Dungeons and Dragons than.
Well, it's the front and back of the book opened up.
I know. What I'm saying is.
Oh, right, because it's just like the main.
It looks like.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe that's what they were trying to do.
Well, yeah, they're trying to
entice people that would be interested in it. Be like, look at this book about Dungeons and Dragons, and then you open it up and you're like, Oh, geez.
Yeah. My favorite thing is there's just a quote. It's not attributed. So to just describe this to you, it's like a blue hand, like a homemade booklet kind of thing. There's this like crazy dragon in the corner that someone has a shitty tattoo of for sure by now. It's like this weird drawing of a dragon. And then in like medieval writings, it says Dungeons and Dragons. And then written all around it in this kind of disarrayed thing are all these people that supposedly it's for, like educators, librarians, pastors, police, parents, and then it has all these people that are involved in writing it. And then there's a quote, and it doesn't attribute to anyone. It doesn't say who this quote is from. It just says, quote, "The more I play D&D, the more I want to get away from this world." You can just see they sat and constructed this idea of like, oh, this is some quote from a teenager who just caught in the grips of D&D.
Where'd you find this graphic?
Oh man, this was from theescapist.com, which is a awesome website if you want to know about all the bullshit that happened around Dungeons and Dragons and the history of it. So inside the very first page is what's called the trophy list. And the trophy list, like I said, became the word that was used in like occult cop circles and all this stuff about to describe the list of young people that had killed themselves that she and Bad had been attributing to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And if you look right here on the first, look at this. See his name? James Dallas Egbert, 1980. Notice he's the first. He's the patient zero for the D&D suicide thing. And then you have some others in here. You have you have Irving Pulling right here. Here's Bink right here, and these other people. We're going to talk about some of these other people. But this was a very effective, and this was their most frequent way to get people to kind of get on board, was presenting them with this list that served as kind of incontrovertible proof to these people listening to that D&D really was killing people. I mean, here's their names and their dates and their ages, and things start to get real weird. So again, from Dangerous Games, quote, "The trophy list was an effective form of propaganda because it appealed to a natural psychological tendency to perceive patterns. Mathematician John Allen Palos used Bad as an example of the broad-based fallacy." So do you know what the broad-based fallacy is? So the broad-based fallacy is this kind of cognitive strategy that we have
in which an argument is made by citing an absolute number of cases rather than the probability of a given phenomenon.
Okay.
So she presents you with a bunch of people that she's telling you killed themselves because of D&D.
Yeah.
And then you sit and you hear about a teenage suicide. You bring up the cases that you remember, and it kind of makes it seem like, well, this must be what's going on. This must be the thing that's happening, is because I can come up with all these examples.
Yeah.
When really you were just fed a bunch of examples in the grand scheme of things, So in fact, Paulus goes on to say that if 3 million people play the game, and the average rate of suicide for people aged 15 to 24 is approximately 12 in 100,000, then there should naturally be about 360 cases of D&D players who commit suicide. Statistically speaking, the trophy list suggests that D&D drastically reduces the rate of teen suicide. He's like, less people are killing themselves involved in D&D than everything else out there in the world. And so statistically, it didn't make sense. But again, it plays upon that thing that our brains just pull information that we've heard of.
Yeah.
Rather than the stuff that we have to go out and find.
Yeah.
And, we come to conclusions like, well, it must be true because I can come to all these.
Yeah.
I can recall all of these cases or whatever. Similarly, psychologists Suzanne Abieta and James Forrest have suggested that role-playing games have become associated with criminal behavior because of a phenomenon called the availability heuristic. This is a psychological phenomenon in which the supposed probability of an event is calculated on the basis of how many examples come to mind, just like I said, right? Thus, if someone can readily think of even a few cases of criminal behavior related to role-playing games, they may simply accept that such games frequently lead to criminality. So, this was an effective tool because it played on these biases that people have and also spoke to people dealing with very intense things a lot of times when it came to parents whose kids killed themselves and things. And so they were ready to, leap on some. The list, of course, begins with James Dallas Egbert, patient zero of the D&D panic. Again, as we saw in episode 1, his death had nothing to do with the influence of D&D, However, he is always listed as the first casualty of Satan when it came to D&D's dark powers. Also on the list are a pair of brothers from Colorado. Their names were Daniel and Stephen Irwin. On November 2nd, 1984, Daniel, who was 14 at the time, took his brother Stephen, who was 12, to a remote spot they would often hang out at. There, Daniel shot Stephen with a .22 caliber pistol and then turned the gun on himself. The two had left suicide notes. 12-year-old Stephen simply read, "I'm sorry, goodbye." Daniel's was more revealing. He wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry that I had to end it this way, but things just came to a close. A man without his freedom is not a man at all. Therefore, this man is targeted for termination, and my goodbyes are now. So shall it be. Love, Dan."
And how old is he?
He's 14.
And he wrote that.
He wrote that. Now we're going to find out something's going on. There was something real going on.
Okay. And they
This was a crazy reaction to what was going on.
Suicide together?
He killed his 12-year-old brother and then himself.
And then the 14. Oh, God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, obviously, there's shit happening with this kid, too.
Well, duh.
Because, fuck, we'll see. We'll see. It's crazy. But, of course, Patricia Pulling and her enlisted crusaders projected their ideas and fears upon his note, claiming it was clearly speaking of him being trapped in the demonic delusion of D&D. The two simply could find no way out but through this desperate act, just like Bink. However, a 1985 article in the Janesville Gazette from the town where they were at added some more facts to the story. Quote, "The two young brothers carried out a murder-suicide pact last fall because the older brother feared his sentencing in an auto theft case, not because of the Dungeons & Dragons fantasy game," their mother said. A stepbrother named Brian is also quoted in the story. "I don't think the game had anything to do with it. It's only a game. They weren't even really into it." There certainly was more going on here as a murder-suicide pact between young brothers over something that wasn't that huge of a crime. In the long run, points to Dan having other issues, but it certainly wasn't brought on by the dark forces of D&D. So, Dan had stole a car and joyrided it, and he got busted.
Uh-huh.
And he was probably going to go to juvie for a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Like, not long.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
But, you know, so that's when he's talking about a man who's not free. He's going to jail.
Yeah.
It was such a little thing that would have been
Being all
over and he'd been
dramatic. Yeah.
fine.
He's being all dramatic.
He's being all dramatic. He had access to a gun,
Yeah.
which was a huge problem with the suicide thing, I think,
Yeah.
back then. It's like now we're like, hey, fucking lock your gun up. Back then it was like, oh, the boy's got to learn how to use a gun, you know? And when you have depressed, emotional teenagers with free access to guns, this is the kind of bullshit that
That's what
happens.
our health officer expressed and got fired for expressing his
Yeah,
ideas about gun safety to prevent suicide.
that's right.
They didn't like that he said that was a problem. And-
Anyway,
Sorry, side note,
I know.
local politics.
getting political.
BS.
Nevertheless, in response to these events and others, in early 1985, BAD petitioned the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to require warning labels be placed on all role-playing games that stated it may cause suicide. The FTC quickly passed this hot potato down to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, who then quickly shuffled it through the process, deciding to take no action in the end. They're like, we're not touching this, you know, because you can't make claims like that. You can't, this is like a federal governmental agency. They can't be like, oh yeah, this may cause you to kill yourself because of Satan. You know, like they're like, get this off of my desk. And they ended up, she failed. And again, this was at a time when there was some success happening in like labeling things. And, you know, so she thought, oh, this is the right time. You know, I've got obviously a powerful message with all these kids killing themselves. But in the end, they didn't take any action, and there never was any warning labels added, obviously, to D&D. Then in September of 1985, Patricia appears on a 60-minute special report on D&D. Now, we're going to take a look at some clips from the episode so we can get more acquainted with Patricia Pulling, and we'll also hear from our old friend and D&D creator, Gary Gygax. And as a special bonus, we're going to be introduced into a new character in this story that will join Patricia and become a really fun story to talk about. Not fun, really, but, aggravating. So in this 60 Minutes segment, or show, really the whole fucking show was based off of Satanic Panic around D&D. Again, this was a time when, like, you would turn on Geraldo and Oprah, and there would be people claiming to be witches and people claiming to worship the devil. And it was just this really, like, crazy time. So 60 Minutes gets in on the game. And so in this first clip, Morley Safer, the host who's kind of telling the story, he's going to talk about the evidence. This is kind of the lead into the segment, and him presenting this idea of that there's evidence that this game is tied to teen suicide and troubled, kids and things like that.
There are those who are fearful that the game in the hands of vulnerable kids could do harm, and there is evidence that seems to support that view. Timothy Grice, 21, a shotgun suicide. The detective report noted D&D became a reality. Irving Bink Pulling, 16, an avid D&D player, a suicide. Daniel and Stephen Irwin, 16 and 12, a murder and a suicide. The police said they were obsessed with the game. James Allen Kirby, 14 years old, charged with killing his junior high school principal and wounding 3 other people. Police are blaming D&D. Jeffrey Jaklovich, 14. Stephen Loyacano, 16. Michael Dempsey, 17. And the list goes on.
Okay, first of all, this was news that they're fucking saying this shit.
Yeah. 60 Minutes.
I understand. Well, it's still the news,
Yeah,
and a lot of people trust it.
Yeah.
But he's throwing a bunch of bullshit that's not true, right?
Well, isn't 60 Minutes where they build a case and then they kind of take it apart at the end?
It's like the. Oh no, it's not.
No. So they're not going to take
60
this
Minutes
apart?
is more like it's like a news magazine show, right?
I know, but so they're not going to take that apart and show how
no.
it's,
They're just presenting it like watch. You'll see what happens in here.
Oh.
But he throws stuff out there like Irving Bink Pulling, an avid D&D player. No, he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
No, he wasn't. Not to the people that said it,
Yeah.
but notice what he said. And then he gets to Dan and Stephen Irwin, who were avid D&D players, according to police.
According to police. Yeah.
According to his family, who fucking lived with him and knew him, they're like, they weren't even into it.
Yeah.
Bink Pulling played for 9 hours. His schoolmates who were into the game were like, nah, he didn't play that much. But when you say the police say this, all of a sudden like, oh shit, the police are involved. And we're going to see that's where Patricia Pulling really sets her sights. So we're going to continue because we're going to look at, so now we're actually going to get to meet Gary Gygax and hear from him himself. Look at him wearing this rad sweater in 1980s, by the way. It's pretty sweet. Yeah. And so this is where he's kind of questioned, like, don't you think this is like bad press for you guys? Like, don't you feel bad that your game is doing this to people? And you can see I like how Gary Gygax, he doesn't really fuck around. He's not mean, but he's definitely snarky. I like it.
Gary Gygax owns the company and invented the game. Dieter Sturm is the head of public relations.
There are a number of cases that have been documented where there is some connection between D&D. I'm not saying that D&D is the cause of the death, but paraphernalia from the game has been found at the scene of the death. Notes, suicide notes referring to the game have been found, and all of these people, in a dozen or so cases, have been documented as avid D&D players. And you see no connection whatsoever?
We see no connection for the fact that right now there's some 3 to 4 million players of the game actively throughout the United States. Right at this particular time,
that's his lawyer. That's not Gary
1985,
Gygax.
teenage suicide is epidemic across the country, with some 5,000 kids a year now taking their lives. I think that to say that because that child played Dungeons & Dragons, who's to say that that child does not watch television, does not participate in high school sports, or what per se?
I have yet to see one bit of valid clinical evidence to show that this has been anything more than coincidental with a disturbed child.
If you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor in each of them, wouldn't you question it? And that's all people do.
I would certainly do it in a scientific manner, and this is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
He's totally right.
Yeah.
Right? He's like, hey, do it in a scientific way and prove
Yeah,
it to me.
Let's do it.
Right. And again, morally safer. Fuck him. He's being real loose with the things. He's like, they're documented as being avid. No, they're documented by Patricia Pulling.
I know. I love how
And
you
bad.
can't see like the scene set up. So what's that guy's name? The interviewer guy.
Morally safer.
Okay, you see him, and he is sitting in front of a thick stack of files,
Yeah.
as if he's got a ton of information.
Just like all of this D&T
this is
stuff.
all proving
It's
what I'm
nuts.
saying, and I think it's just drama. He's just like showing, looking like he's got all the info because he's researched.
And this just goes to show you, like, when they make statements, none of those were true. I know these are true because I read books and read statements from these people, but Patricia Pulling was saying this was true.
And I feel like Morley also would know, but he's just
This
creating drama.
this
for the
is
show.
when entertainment news was
was-
fucking getting off the ground, right? It was ratings
Yeah.
game period. So as you can see, the lawyer's like, hey, we got a lot of suicides going on. It doesn't seem to be tied to our game. Prove it, And then Gary Gygax is like, fuck you. You're just throwing shit at me. Prove it to me.
Yeah.
But this isn't scientific. This is just anecdotal, and these are just people that are, trying to search for answers to difficult things.
Yeah. And he was exactly right. Witch hunt, because the witch hunts were looking to blame women in a time when men had been found to do something wrong or have some issue, and then they looked to blame women for it. Witch hunt.
Yeah.
So, not to make it a gender thing, but just to make it this group of people, I'm going to scapegoat my issue onto.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what they did in the witch hunt.
Yeah, pretty crazy. And so now we're actually going to get to meet Patricia herself. Hold on a second. So now we're going to get to meet Patricia herself in this next clip as she discusses the whole curse that she says was placed upon her son that apparently worked, or at least brainwashed him into thinking that it worked and caused him to have to kill himself before he murdered his family as a werewolf.
Pat and Lee Pulling and their 12-year-old daughter, Melissa. The Pullings came home one night 3 years ago and found Bink, their son, dead on the front lawn of their home in Montpelier, Virginia. He had shot himself through the heart with his father's handgun. Until that night, they had never heard of the game Dungeons and Dragons. Then they began looking through his things.
We went into the kitchen, and there on the table were what we thought were just regular composition books with schoolwork in it, and much of the Dungeons and Dragons material, along with this curse he had received in the game that day that he died.
The curse that was placed on Bink's D&D character began, "Your soul is mine. I choose the time." In a letter that he left, Bink said he had been summoned to kill himself because he was evil.
So, as you can see, she's reinforcing this idea that, it was just tons of D&D material and a curse, and clearly he was doing this.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, we're pretending that curses are real, or that, all of this stuff is just crazy to think about, first of all. Okay, let's say that your son was so susceptible that if he would have received a curse from anywhere, he would have acted it out, apparently. Right? I mean, who gives a shit if it was D&D? It could have been anywhere. It could have been from a TV show or a movie you heard or a book you read. This idea of, that. But she's chosen D&D because it was just the most convenient thing I think she could get her mind around, right? It looked evil. She didn't understand it. It must be D&D. I don't know. So now she's going to go on and she's going to tell us, again, this is a lie, because we've heard quotes from her and things that she said in police. Some of the quotes I've said from her are from briefings and stuff she's done for police around the occult crimes and shit like that. And she has you know, early on, she talked quite a bit about the fact that her son was acting weird beforehand, right? She talked about running on all fours, which, again, not sure if that was happening, but she's alluding that something was off and killing the animals and just there was weird stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
So listen to what she says to Morley Safer on 60 Minutes here.
Your son was well-adjusted?
Always. He had never had psychological problems. He was healthy, even physically healthy.
And you saw her face, right? She's like, absolutely. She just, that is not what she says.
Yeah.
When she's talking about the events leading up to her son in other places.
Right.
And so she's on this show selling this hard. They already changed the detail too. It was his father's gun. I'm sure she did that to avoid, because having your mom's,
yeah, that's weird. Back then, you'd be like, his mom has a gun?
Yeah.
Now it's like totally cool.
Yeah.
Women having guns, and it's like, you should. But back then, I think it would have been
It's like, of course his
what?
father had a gun. It was for protecting his family.
Right.
But when he shoots himself with his mom's gun, all of a sudden his mom's like, why do you have a gun? And like, what was going on between him and his mom? You know, and I feel like they kind of, hey, just say it was your gun on TV, which is fucked up. But as you can see, she's like, no, he was just so well adjusted. No, he wasn't.
Yeah.
The people that were around him, to the point that she sued the principal because he didn't see how disturbed her son was.
Yeah.
And yet she's saying, no.
He was fine.
So why did you fucking sue the school then?
Yeah.
If he was so well adjusted. You know, that seems to lead up to this, you know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So now is when we're going to get acquainted with a new guy, a guy who would become a partner in occult crime with, not in occult crime, a partner fighting occult crime in the media with and alongside Patricia Pulling.
Dr. Thomas Radecki is a psychiatrist who teaches at the University of Illinois Medical School and who is chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence. He has been studying the game for several years and says there are 28 deaths related to Dungeons & Dragons in the last 5 years.
In some of those, it was clearly the decisive element. In other ones, it was just a major element in the thinking of the people at the time they committed suicide or murder. Is not coincidence, not when you have careful documentation, you have careful notes, you have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel coming from the Dungeons and Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body, and he's never come back.
So that's Thomas Radecki. We're going to talk about him in a little bit, because that little motherfucker needs to be severely beaten. Okay. But again, notice the authoritative manner in which they're stating these things. He's like, there are 28 suicides that are clearly documented. No, there is not. There was not a single one that was documented to be caused by Dungeons & Dragons. There's never been a single murder case ever that had Dungeons & Dragons play a part in it. That was, none of this has happened, but he's fucking saying it. He's a psychologist that works for University of Illinois.
Yeah.
He's like leads this media thing where it's supposed to be protecting the children, right, from evil influences. And he's just throwing shit out there like it's true. And none of it is. And millions of people are watching this going, my kid plays, just fucking crazy. Okay. We're going to listen to a couple more clips, and then we're going to revisit Mr. Thomas Radecki, right? Because this motherfucker, he's just real great. Okay, so in this next one, we're going to see kind of like Patricia's evolving theory around what Dungeons & Dragons is doing to young people.
Okay.
It is not like Monopoly. There is no board. It is role-playing, which is typically used for behavior modification. If you are using behavior modification and you are doing violent roles and you're doing negative roles continuously, these children not only begin to have violent dreams or violent thoughts or negative, depressing type things, they become very much a part of this character.
Okay, so I love that statement. She's like, you're playing a role. And what's role-playing used for? Typically for behavior modification. What? Have you ever heard of that? Of course not. Like, what the fuck? She's just, again, saying shit. But everyone else is like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Sounds true to me, I guess.
Okay.
You told me a bunch of people killed themselves because of this game. A University of Illinois psychologist just told me that a bunch of them were documented and proven. And now you're telling me that it's just trying to brainwash and manipulate our children through behavior modification. It's just a plot, basically, that's happening. You're like, oh, fuck, right?
Yeah.
Crazy. 60 Minutes. This isn't like the 700 Club. I'd expect this shit on there, right? It's literally prime time. Wild. So in this last one, I wanted to play this. So this is Bink's sister. And I don't know what the fuck. I've watched this so many times, and I don't know what the fuck's going on here. I don't know if this girl was pressured or led into tying these things, but it does give you a little bit of understanding into the fact that there was shit going on with Bink. His sister clearly came into contact with this, whatever was going on psychologically in him.
Yeah.
And I think then she kind of was led to tie it to Dungeons and Dragons as being the cause. But I think there's truth here in that something happened because this girl is clearly not faking.
Yeah.
But I don't know if her narrative wasn't coached by her parents.
Right.
I've already watched them change details in this story from what she said in other places. So they're crafting something here. And it's TV. Of course they're crafting. They're acting, in a way. But this is Bink's sister.
Little sister.
Yeah, she's little.
But for some kids, it's not as simple as that. Melissa claimed that D&D had become more than just a game for her brother Bink.
Someone threatened you?
Yes. My brother threatened to kill me one time.
And we found out later that he had threatened to kill her if she told us that he was playing the game.
Okay, so she says he threatened to kill me one time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I grew up with an older sister. I said I was going to kill her all the time, but I don't know. But this kid, if we tie that to some of the other things that seem to be leaning towards some,
and she's clearly upset and
she was
scared of her brother.
She didn't take it
you
as a
guys
joke.
Didn't see the video. She's crying.
She's crying, and then notice her dad steps in. Says later we found out it was because he wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons.
That was that Morley guy that said that.
No, that was her dad.
Her dad.
Her dad steps in and says, we found out later it was because he was playing Dungeons and Dragons and he told her he would kill her if she told us.
Right. She didn't add that.
Yeah.
She was just crying, saying that he had threatened to kill her.
She was just remembering it was really scary when my brother flipped out on me and it was frightening. I thought he might kill me. Probably. I don't know. I'm putting
and that
words.
goes along with if he was killing animals,
absolutely
psychopath.
Yeah. Like things weren't right with Bink.
Yeah.
And now you see, and I feel really, really bad about her. Actually, I don't know if I should say I totally stalked her on Facebook.
I
and
did
found
too.
Her. Oh, you
After
did?
we talked about her that first time.
Yeah, she's doing good.
She's doing good.
She is. No, she's doing good.
Yeah.
She's like not involved in all this nonsense. She's past it. Anyway, good job, Melissa. I'm sorry you had to be used as a fucking prop in your mom's stuff. I mean, I know you loved her, and I'm glad you did.
And use their kids for their...
But let's talk a little more about Mr. Thomas Radecki, the supposedly trustworthy voice of rational, scientific, psychologically focused criticism against D&D. He served as chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence. Later, it would be discovered that BAD and NCTV were essentially a single force, and any ideas of him being a neutral party were totally false. Their messaging was crafted together, with Radecki playing the part of impartial confirmation of BAD's assertions of D&D's dangerous influence. Right? So he was always billed as this guy, like, this independent, unbiased, totally unconnected person that's just saying, like, she's right because of science.
Yeah.
I'm just backing it up. I'm confirming it. But it turns out, no, all this material they did this together.
Yeah.
Right? And so there was, anyway, in the 60-minute segment, he states, quote, "It is not coincidence. Not when you have careful documentation. You have careful notes. You have eyewitnesses. For instance, in one case, the parents actually saw their child summon a Dungeons and Dragons demon." Like, did Gary Gygax create new demons for real? Like, how do you have a Dungeons and Dragons demon? I don't know. But apparently, he summoned a Dungeons & Dragons demon to his room before he killed himself. That's what he claims, right?
There's documentation of it.
Yeah. First off, so you believe in demonic possession, Mr. Psychologist. Not only that, but I love how during the 80s and 90s, we just assumed that everyone, teens, parents, pastors, whoever, not only knew what summoning a demon looked like, but knew how to perform the ritual in the first place. I love that. They're like, he was clearly summoning a demon. I'm like, you know how to
Clearly?
summon a demon? Like he was doing it right? Like notice what he said. He was summoning a demon and he was following the rules of the book.
Yeah.
First of all, there's no rules on how to summon a demon in D&D manuals, but no one's reading it.
Yeah,
so he can
so they
just
don't
say
know.
that
Yeah.
shit and he's a psychologist.
Yeah.
Why would he lie to me?
Yeah.
Right? Surrounded by his materials, he says.
Yeah.
What materials, Mr. Radecki? Tell me again how to summon a demon. This
Yeah.
is fucking stupid.
Yeah.
But they were like, dude, I saw this album cover of, had a pentagram. What was that one?
What?
Who's the band that did Tom Sawyer? Rush. Remember their album was Moving Pictures, and it was this guy in a pentagram, a naked guy, and we were told at church camp, this is how you summon a demon.
I didn't listen to that.
You didn't remember that?
Satan music.
No, I'm not saying about the first of all, Rush is about as far from Satan music as you can
I
get.
didn't know, but I was in the church back then, and I believed it was satanic. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Capitalizing on the satanic panic, they put this picture on one of their album covers where they're like carrying a mirror, and in the mirror is this kind of naked guy like standing in a pentagram. And I just remember being told as a Christian teen, like, this is how you summon a demon. What they're showing you is that they know and they are summoning a demon. And by playing this, you're allowing that demonic energy to enter. Rush didn't know. First of all, Rush didn't design that album cover.
Yeah.
They didn't even come up with that album cover. Someone else did.
They're just capitalizing on the
and they didn't know how to summon a demon either. But they're like, this is badass.
People like this.
Like, make them naked. Yes. So there was this idea that everyone knew all this occult magic and they could just spot it.
Yeah.
And it's like, fuck off. Like, that's so stupid. Anyway. Of course, all of this supposed expertise in demonology came by way of fundamental voices decrying album covers, movies, and Saturday morning cartoons, while they explained that they were really showing demonic rituals and magic. He is likely speaking of the suicide of Michael Dempsey in May of 1981, number 2 on Bad's trophy list. Quoting again from Joseph Laycock's Dangerous Games, quote, Patrick Dempsey, a retired police officer from Seattle, also became a leader in Bad after his son Michael committed suicide in 1981. Dempsey's interpretation of Michael's death was even more overtly supernatural. He describes an argument before his son killed himself and relates how Michael's voice changed as if demonically possessed. That night, Michael shot himself. Dempsey describes smelling sulfur and garlic at the scene of the suicide. Yeah. Although it would be...
Why would you have garlic? You're summoning a demon that is supposed to, like, repel them.
I know, but people hear that and they go like, yeah, that sounds like supernatural shit.
All the things.
Oh, fucking Jesus Christ. Let's see. That night, Michael shot himself. Dempsey described smelling sulfur and garlic at the scene of the suicide. Although it would be normal...
trying to keep the vampires away
I know,
from the
there's
demon.
a
The vampires hate the garlic, it's a whole party.
The demon showed up and sulfur, and then
He
the
was
vampire showed up and went, oh, there's
evil
garlic. I got to get
yeah.
out of here. It's a whole scene. Monsters just trying to, like, schedule it correctly. Although it would be normal to smell sulfur in a room where a gun had just been fired, Dempsey interprets this as a sign of demonic activity. Later, a conservative evangelical tract reported that, quote, witnesses saw him trying to summon up D&D demons just minutes before his death, unquote. So, we see how this little telephone game gets going, right?
Also, I'm gonna
the cop has a... Oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to say the garlic. Sometimes body odor smells like garlic. Teenage boys, anxiety, body odor.
Yeah.
Then shoot a gun. You got sulfur and garlic.
Yeah. I think it's more this guy just watched movies and that's where he got all his information about supernatural things. And so it's like, there's got to be garlic in here. I smell it. I'm pretty sure. But anyway, as you can see, kid got in a fight with his cop dad. Right?
Normal.
normal. Kid was obviously disturbed. Again, had access to a gun, obviously. Kid shoots himself. Dad invents this narrative that, man, when he was arguing with me, his voice changed, like he was demonically possessed.
Mm-hmm.
Something must have taken over him. He just wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
And then after he goes, here's the gunshot, runs in, and it must have been a demon. I smelled sulfur and garlic. It's pretty wild.
So wild.
But this fucking psychologist says it's documented, and he even mentions the demonic summoning thing on 60 Minutes. And people are like, oh, holy shit.
We know it's true. He said it.
This is real?
It's fact. He said it.
Yeah. So psychological stress leads to supernatural self-delusion, which gets embellished by an evangelical tract. They just threw that thing in like, oh, people saw him summoning demons. No, they didn't. That's not how it started at all. It started by his dad surmising he was in an attempt to offload his guilt.
Yeah.
And then this tract, this evangelical organization, I should have looked into it. Maybe it was Jack Chick. I don't know. But this
Chick
organization picks it up and like adds a little thing of like, people saw him doing this, which then lends us credibility to people reading it that are gullible and believing all this bullshit. And they're just like, oh, hey, man, people saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like how we know Jesus rose from the dead. People saw it, man.
People saw
People saw it.
People saw it.
That's what people
Witnesses.
still tell me. They're like, there were witnesses.
There
I'm
were
like,
witnesses.
were there? I got a story, too, that there were a bunch of witnesses, too. You want to hear it? Anyway, this is how belief forms. Here's how it's gone so far with D&D. Dallas Egbert disappears. William Deere makes up a story about Dungeons & Dragons being part of it to try and trump up his image as some master investigator and cult hunter. It gets repeated and escalated in the media. People dealing with their own loss, guilt, and pain find an alternative narrative which they can adopt. Then they tell their own stories with details that are linked to the particular situation and the psychological traumas they were experiencing. Stories that are then repeated by experts and inflated with new details on 60 Minutes for the public at large to then take as fact and believe to be true. And so you can see these very mundane, human, tragic things get kind of like curated and changed and altered and morphed and utilized for different ways, and it turns into a belief that really is based off of nothing that was really going on. And the next thing you know, we're gripped with this idea. But let's continue to look into Mr. Radecki here, the psychology who is so concerned about the children.
Psychologist.
Oh, I'm sorry. The psychologist who is so concerned about the children. Thomas traveled all over the country with Patricia to warn police and concerned parents about the satanic plot behind D&D. A press release put out in 2003 by a group called Computers for Christ. The 2003 internet was fucking awesome.
2003, oh my god.
Oh yeah, this is when not a lot of people are on the internet. Me and Hunter, our son, were just talking about this earlier. Like, the internet was fun back then because the only people that were able to create stuff on it were people that took the time to actually learn how to do it because it wasn't as easy as there is now.
Yeah.
Now that we made it for any idiot to fucking do anything on there, it's insufferable. But back then it was pretty fun. And there happened to be Computers for Christ on there, right? And the Computers for Christ quoted Thomas Radecki. They did some interview and they're like put out a quote from him. This was his quote. Quote, "While Dungeons & Dragons is a game of cooperation and working together, that cooperation involves cooperating in violence, premeditated murder, and war. While it does stimulate it," by the way, all of that's in the Bible, over and over and over and over. And, over. And God's doing it. It's not like, don't do this. It's like, God's pissed off and he fucking starts murdering people.
But he can. He's allowed. He's
God. Yeah. He even punishes them for not killing enough children and innocent people a couple times. Anyway, Dungeons & Dragons is chock full of that shit. While it does stimulate creative fantasies, these fantasies are of killing and horror. There is a need to get the honest information out to the American people. The research is overwhelming that violent entertainment is having a harmful effect on its participants. the changes are most often gradual and subtle. When a children's game is documented to cause many deaths, it should not be promoted through advertising and cartoon programming. Every Saturday morning, millions of children see the half-hour CBS Dungeons & Dragons cartoon introducing them to this violent game. So, as we talked about, the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon, which I watched at this time, had nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. It didn't teach you shit about it, and it didn't make me want to play Dungeons & Dragons. But it was super dumb and fun to watch. But as you can see, he's like, come on, man, I'm a psychologist. Violent programming and violent games are just affecting our youth, right? Here's some other quotes from about Mr. Radecki from other sources. Right? So that's what Computers for Christ said about Mr. Radecki, right? Or quoting him as. So here are some other things that kind of were being said about him. So in a news report read on Entertainment Weekly, quote, the state of Illinois revoked his license to practice psychiatry in 1992 for a minimum of 5 years because of allegations of inappropriate sexual activity by Dr. Radecki with one of his female patients. From 2011 to 2012, he was investigated by multiple law enforcement agencies. From a Clarion, Pennsylvania news article, quote, Radecki ran 4 clinics in Clarion, Dubois, Seneca, and Kane that were supposed to treat people addicted to heroin and prescription painkillers. Radecki traded Suboxone, used to treat those addicted to opiates, for sex with several of his female patients, many of them underage.
Shit show.
One of them even was pregnant by Radecki, and another who came to Radecki for psychiatric counseling left an addict after he prescribed her powerful drugs for a shoulder problem another physician was treating. Apparently, he was setting up treatment houses in the area under an organization he founded called Doctors and Lawyers for a Drug-Free Youth. However, in reality, he was using this as a way to sexually assault teenagers and young women by forcing them to trade sex for the prescription drugs they were desperately needing in order to deal with heroin and opioid addictions. They even found video evidence of him having inappropriate sexual contact with patients that he recorded on cameras that he had installed himself. This guy is a huge piece of shit.
You just pretty much need to, like, any kind of righteous warrior out that's leading some charge against something. And
it's a cover.
They're probably doing some dark shit.
No, absolutely.
You just have to fucking, like,
listen, when you hear
like, if you're standing up against something,
yeah,
in some self-righteous way, I immediately am gonna wonder what
are you
fucking doing in the dark.
Yes. It's kind of like those pastors who get up and rail against homosexuality.
Yeah.
They want to suck dick so bad.
Yeah.
And they're so, they're trying to hide this by the lady doth protest too much or whatever.
Yeah.
And here, this, it's like whenever you see someone really going after something and really won't let go of it, you're like, oh, what are you diverting me from? And this motherfucker is a piece of shit, doing untold damage to people while he's out there decrying D&D and like this moral crusade for the sake of the children and the dangerous violence that they're seeing on Saturday morning cartoons. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison in 2013 and tried to get out early in 2016, claiming he was too old to be in prison.
Oh my God.
He was 72. Fuck off. 72?
Yeah,
You're
fuck
fine.
off, you're fine, asshole.
The judge refused to let him out, and he will be in prison until he was 81 years old. I think we can seriously discount any supposed expertise Radecki brought to the D&D panic.
You're done.
By 1987, Patricia Pulling completes a private investigator course, I guess in night school or something, I don't know, in order to bolster her cred as an occult crime expert. You see, as rumors of cultic and ritualistic crimes being committed in the name of Satan spread throughout our culture, the cops were some of the most active participants in all of this nonsense. The thing is, they're cops, not occult experts. They believed that dark satanic crimes were happening everywhere, but they needed some training in order to spot them. Right? They're like, we believe you that hundreds of thousands of Satanists are like stealing women to impregnate them with sacrificial babies they kill, and they're all this stuff.
Sense to, like, cops seeing so much dark shit.
No, I know.
They're like,
it makes sense.
Wanting to make sense of the fucking world that they see. They're like, it's the devil. It has
and
to
it's
be.
not like the
so
police
dark.
are full of rational, reasonable people. They're full of people that believe a bunch of fucking nonsense also, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like all of us, they believe a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of cops that are like, they're ready to fight Satan because,
Yeah.
that makes their job even more meaningful, Enter Patricia Pulling, PI. In January of 1988, Pulling
A
stated
little
in a,
less hot than Magnum.
I know. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Fucking Patricia Pulling, PI. With creepy Thomas Radecki right next to her. In January of 1988, Pulling stated in a Style Weekly article that she, quote, conservatively estimates that about 8% of the Richmond, Virginia area population is involved with satanic worship at some level. 8%.
8%.
A Richmond News Leader article notes this would be roughly 56,000 people, more than the number of United Methodists in the Richmond area and nearly the entire population of the Hanover County. I love that. She's like, I conservatively estimate that, I don't know, 8% of Richmond, where she lived. Richmond, this is fucking great. She went on to say that she had gotten the 8% figure by estimating 4% of the area's teenagers and 4% of the adults. And she just added the figures. That's not how fucking math works.
She just guessed 4%, just threw out a
It
percentage?
doesn't even matter. Let me explain to you that isn't even 8%. Okay? So say you had a population of 100 people. Okay?
Yeah.
Say you have 100 people. 50% adults, 50% teenagers.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just say
Okay.
kids.
Yeah.
4% of 50 is 2,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So you got 2 adults, 2 kids. 2 plus 2 is 4. It's still 4% of the total, right? You don't go like 4% adults, 4% teenagers, 8% of people. That doesn't work like that. That's not how math works. So she doesn't even fucking
But I'm
understand
just saying,
that.
like, where did she grab the 4
No,
from?
she made that shit
She just
up.
Like, pulled that out of her ass.
And then I'm showing you that she obviously doesn't even understand percentages or
Yeah,
how math
no.
works. So she's just literally throwing shit out. But math is hard. And so I want to read to you. This is kind of a lengthy quote, but this is from In Pursuit of Satan. So this was written by Robert Hicks, who kind of investigated this whole phenomenon of because what would follow would be hundreds of seminars and trainings that would you can go watch them on YouTube, by the way. Like there's digital from the VHS tapes of these guys that presented these tapes. Oh, it's so fucking great what they imagined Satanism and stuff to look like.
Yeah.
It's so great. Like the most low budget horror movie vision of what it is. And they're teaching the cops that these are real things to look for or whatever,
Yeah.
But anyway, this is from In Pursuit of Satan. Quote, an influential speaker, Patricia A. Pulling, who founded Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, offers a one-day workshop, Teen Satanism and the Occult. She offers it to mental health professionals in Staunton and Waynesboro, Virginia. In a brochure festooned with no fewer than 22 pentagrams, Pulling describes her credentials as a, quote, private investigator whose, quote, list of degrees, honors, and awards is innumerable. That means you don't have any, by the way, when you say that. I have so many you can't even imagine. Because if you had 10, you'd be like, I have 10. But
I know.
I have
Even
so
if you had
many.
50, you'd be like,
No.
I know them all, but innumerable, you've gone too far.
And she says degrees, honors, and awards, which is all very laudatory towards yourself. It's kind of like people think I'm great.
I'm
like a
amazing.
lot of people think
Everybody
I'm
knows
great.
I've
Yeah.
gotten a lot.
Yeah, it's fucking so great. Who, quote, has been a guest on several hundred shows from coast to coast, including 60 Minutes, we just watched that, and CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network's The 700 Club. Of course she was on there. You're talking about Satan? Get on here, girl!
Get over here.
For mental health professionals in Hampton, Virginia, Pulling taught the hidden danger, adolescent involvement in Satanism and the occult, and discussed the use of culture in Satanism and the occult, black metal and other occult music, fantasy role-playing games, and teen devil worship. none of which she even knew anything about, but anyway. She warns that, quote, the practices of witchcraft and Satanism among adolescents are on the rise in the country. Concerning the role-playing games, she states adolescents involved with one role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons, have been linked to at least 125 documented suicides and murders in the last 10 years. You see this number growing, right?
Getting big.
Well, it has to. It has to be getting worse, or else it's not a real problem.
Yeah.
If we're still using the same fucking trophy list, that's not going to be effective. It has to be seen as a continuous systemic problem, right? So, you know, she's just crazy. In August of 1989, Patricia Pulling released her book, The Devil's Web, Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan, which is the perfect title for if you're selling fear, that is like, she nailed it.
Yeah.
From Dangerous Games again, quote, The Devil's Web is a veritable who's who of the satanic cult scare. The foreword is by Maury Terry, an investigative reporter who claimed that David Berkowitz, the son of Sam killer, had been part of a satanic conspiracy. He wasn't, by the way. He killed a bunch of people because he's a fucking asshole.
Yeah.
And he went to jail and found Jesus. And then the next thing you know, the Christian church and all the Christian media turned him into this darling and this redemption story. Because that's the best story, right? It's like, and then he started claiming that it was actually, he was part of a satanic conspiracy and kind of brainwashed and led into this thing. It wasn't his fault. And of course, they were ready to receive that as well. It was all nonsense, but that's, he's like kind of like saying, this book is great, you know, about her book. The back contains endorsements from Tipper Gore, who was busy trying to censor shit, and the producers of both 60 Minutes and Entertainment Tonight, you fucking assholes. The acknowledgments list dozens of cult cops and mental health professionals around the country who were friendly to theories of satanic abuse. Theories that, by the way, have all been disproven.
Yeah.
This was the age of really dubious psychological techniques on children, recovering memories which more often than not implanted memories and led them into this writing memories almost in them into these children, and then putting people in jail for doing things that are absolutely impossible and not bound in any real world scenario, but we're so ready to believe the supernatural.
I'm super grateful that I studied hypnotherapy in 2017 rather than 2000 or 1990, because they didn't know as much as they do now. And so I was taught, you can't trust memories. You take someone into hypnosis. It's fact.
Right.
Fiction. Filters.
Yeah. We understand so much more about the subconscious
doesn't mean
now.
whatever they say in hypnosis does not mean it's actual fact of what happened. And do not believe it or do not lead them to believe it. But back then in the 90s, I remember they were...
Oh, it was fringe
They were
shit.
saying, oh, if you said it in hypnosis, that's true.
You're like, hey, that just came right out of your brain.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was all fringe stuff being performed by really shady fucking people.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, remember that whole Sybil thing with the multiple personalities? Remember all that shit? It's all turned out to not be true. It was all fucking basically someone fucking with someone's mind.
Yeah.
And, you know, good times.
Yeah.
In 1990, a prominent RPG proponent named Michael Stackpole, I love that name. Stackpole. I don't know why it's cool. Investigated Bad and put out a document that is now known as the Pulling Report. This is a big thing in the D&T world. The Pulling Report. Some quotes. Let me give you some quotes from the Pulling Report from Michael Stackpole. Quote, in her The Who, What, When, Where, and How of Teen Satanism. That's a great title. I'm going to read that again because it's so funny. The Who, What, When, Where, and How of Teenage Satanism.
Teenage Satanism.
I don't know why that's so funny to me. It's just like, just imagining this mom like, I'm bothered about Dungeons & Dragons. And like, the who, what, when, I don't know. It's just great. She appends to the how section this curious note. This is what she says. Quote, the two basic principles apply here. Law of attraction and the law of invitation. These are not laws in any judicial sense. They are laws of magic, and they govern the supernatural in the same way that the laws of thermodynamics govern our physical reality. There is no doubt about it, Patricia Pulling fervently believes that devils and demons not only exist, but they can be summoned and used to cause physical effects in our world. So, just like the scientifically confirmed and understood laws of thermodynamics, these magical laws that she's making up are operating unbeknownst to us and being tapped into by teenagers looking to unleash Satan on Earth. Okay, wow, that's pretty wild. Again, you see this just like real stuff, my fake stuff is real. It's like you can't just lean on thermodynamics to tell me the laws of magic are real. That doesn't work.
This real thing here.
Yeah,
my imagination is just as real.
Yeah, trust me. But again, this is something that is still prevalent in the thinking of many magical thinkers. These ideas that there are these universal magical laws that bound. Like when we talked about adrenochrome and we talked about how they can't just do it to us, they have to let us know that they're doing it to us to almost get our buy-in, like these evil people that are like using these satanic dark magic things over us. It's almost like they can't just surprise us with it or do it to us. They have to like get us to accept it because it's a law, right? And that's what she's basically saying is like there are laws that operate just like the laws of nature, but they're happening behind the scenes. And I know about it because I'm a private investigator in the occult crimes and I have innumerable awards, degrees, and, all this shit.
Honors.
So fucking great. In a section concerning her son's suicide, the Pulling report states, quote, in her statements meant for civilian consumption, she acts as if her son's death caught her utterly unawares, as if she had no clues about his troubles. Yet in court, she tries to sue a principal for having ignored signs of emotional problems that were present in her son. These very signs she herself describes in hideous detail to law enforcement professionals a full 2 years before appearing on Geraldo and 3 years before writing her book. Now, obviously, it took some curating and development.
She was on Geraldo?
Oh, yeah. Dude, Geraldo had her on more than once. I think she was on fucking Oprah, too. Because, remember, they're media whores, too.
Yeah.
They're not telling you the truth. Anyone tells me, like, Oprah, I trust Oprah. Fuck off. You know what Oprah trusts you to do? Buy her shit. That's what she trusts you to do. Bigger house, bigger car, but she gives away cars. That is bullshit to Oprah. And she doesn't even pay for those fucking cars, I guarantee you. So Geraldo was definitely on this bandwagon. Dude, I bet you Geraldo has been talking about fucking D&D in the last 5 years being connected to satanic.
Crazy
Yeah, he's gone crazy. What did you just say that we should name the vaccine for coronavirus after Donald Trump? Because that would be a nice thing to do. I'm like, okay, Geraldo.
Wackadoodle.
Yeah. Anywho. Obviously, it took some curating and development along the way to hone her message. Details early on that seemed to distract from the Satan and D&D angle were dropped while magical principles were elevated. Pulling would work through the mid to late 80s, presenting herself as an expert in identifying and dealing with satanic and occult crime, which wasn't happening. Police organizations would form, populated by cops ready to believe, who would then hire Patricia Pulling and Thomas Radecki as experts in occult crime, listening as they detail the clear evidence that D&D was a tool of Satanists to modify the behavior of teenage boys, leading them to murder and commit suicide. Wild, right? Yeah. In her wake, all kinds of fun cult cop experts arrived on the scene, hawking workshops and instructional videos on how to spot and identify the work of Satan during criminal investigations by the police. You can find many of these videos on YouTube. Today, they are hilarious reminders of how silly things got, but in the 80s and 90s, they were shown to thousands of policemen who then took their newfound expertise out to find the devil under every rock. While the news was filled with police departments decrying the rise in teenage occult violence, no evidence of such horrific events ever surfaced.
No, were these like side trainings that weren't required for police to go to, that the department wasn't paying for, but police could go to on the side?
So in many cases, that was true.
Yeah.
And then in some other cases, they brought her in actually in official capacity.
Yeah. Well, kind of like the way they do today with the,
sure.
What's his name?
Killology bullshit and stuff.
Yeah, like it's a side training, but then some police departments like Spokane pay for him to come.
Exactly. Great. Yeah, it was a mix. It was just like that. Like in
So
some
I
cases
would
are
say
like, oh, sign up for this, and it was like
So
held.
my point in saying that is not all cops
No, of course not.
are
Of course
we're
not.
chasing Satanists.
Of course not. There was plenty of cops that were like, guys, this is bullshit.
This is stupid as
Yeah,
fuck.
yeah,
Stop
yeah,
it.
yeah.
And then
Well, we're not talking about those cops.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were plenty of rational cops going like, come on, Satan, guys. Come on. Anyway, let's see.
Like I doubt your dad was buying into that.
No, not at all. My dad was not caught up in anything
Even
like
as
that.
a-
My dad was a policeman for the LAPD for almost 30 years.
And even as a Christian man, he wouldn't have gone into that because he's
Yeah, but my parents were like the good kind of Christian. They're just like, hey, man, let's not get fucking crazy. Like
Yeah.
we go to church and
We go to
hang out with
church.
people on Sunday.
Yeah.
It's all good. We're good people. But
Don't
they
be
weren't like,
weird.
yeah, they
Yeah,
weren't
were
looking
like,
for
"Don't be
Satan
weird,
anywhere.
just do your
Yeah.
thing."
If I'd have been like, hey guys, can I get Dungeons and Dragons? They'd be like, sure, but I didn't fucking want it, you know,
Yeah.
so I didn't ask for it. Let's see. While Bad had no lasting cultural changes like other moral crusades, such as the Parents Music Resource Center, which were able to bring about, you know, those stickers that said explicit lyrics and all this stuff, warning labels on music. When they needed someone to speak towards the evil dangers of D&D, though, they reached out Patricia, devil investigator. Patricia Pulling died September 18th, 1997 from lung cancer, and with her, Bad also expired. Without her energy and as parents moved on to more current fears and concerns in the technological age, Bad just evaporated, and gradually the moral panic around D&D subsided. In the end, she had testified for at least 3 criminal cases in which a D&D defense was being used, an idea that surely sprung out of Bad's propaganda and crazy ideologies. During this period, there were at least 8 cases in which murderers claimed that they were driven to violence due to D&D. Every single attempt failed at these defenses. Everyone in court's like, okay, whatever. A game made you do it. Shut the fuck up. You're going to jail, you know. Today, the idea of being afraid of a game like Dungeons & Dragons and thinking that actual magic and demons were working through the game is laughable. However, not that long ago, it represented a significant facet of the satanic panic that had gripped mainstream ideas and media. And understand, these things have just been replaced by other things now because our world is different. Complaining about a board game is so not in line with the information social media age we're in now that you can't, who gives a shit what you're playing, you know. It's much more tied to, you know, like these internet conspiracy things. Satan's big in the
oh yeah, Satan's back.
Yeah, he's big.
Satan's
he's
back
big in
in 2020.
Yeah,
he's the boogeyman again.
He's just not fucking with, you know, games anymore. He's just
no, it's other ways, but
he's turned to
Democrats.
Democrats.
I just like seriously, like we haven't heard about Satanism for so long. I thought it, you know, we'd evolved, but
no, we're just
no.
So great. It serves as a reminder that the things that we currently believe will one day, probably sooner than later, be seen as silly and ludicrous. We never think that.
Yeah.
We think like, well, at least I finally made it to a time when we understand things. You're like, no.
No.
In 20 years, people will be going like, can you believe these fucking morons believe this bullshit? And we wholeheartedly believe it. So we just have to really embrace that and understand that so we don't get out of control. The main thing to take away from this, however, is the role that belief and faith played in this societal drama. We can blame it on the people spreading and amplifying the anecdotes and theories being presented, and they certainly share some blame. The media loves a good fear-based narrative, and this was a juicy one. That is a truth we are all aware of, though, and thus we as a society need to accept the blame in such fantastical conspiracy theories. However, when it comes down to it, the only reason such ideas were allowed to grow was because people heard them, accepted them as truth, and went no further. This was in the 1980s and early 90s. Our ability to get information was different than now. And yet, more information has only created more nonsensical and misinformed belief. The internet has given billions of people a global megaphone to weave false narratives and causalities. Unlike 4 decades ago, we have the immediate ability to fact check, learn, gain perspective, and hear all of the sides of virtually any issue or idea. Unfortunately, we also have the ability to generate, propagate, and consume equally crazy accusations that lead to similarly delusional beliefs in our society and culture. This, unfortunately, means nothing has actually changed all that much.
Yeah, like we have to know the way our minds work, how we think we're rational and we're not. We're doing an episode on that.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand logical fallacy and logic and all of that. Like, we have to be smarter, actually, because of all the information coming at us.
Yeah.
We have to educate ourselves better to be able to navigate it without being taken by it. So more information is only useful if you are equipped to decipher it.
Great point. Absolutely 100% right. Like, we, as more information is coming at us and more ideas are assaulting us and hijacking all of these things that our human brain is about, we have to become more and more aware that's happening.
Like, seriously, we actually need a college education to exist in the world that we've created successfully. It's a need. Like, we thought kindergarten, elementary, junior high, high school were basic levels of education that we would need to survive successfully in this world. But our world is expanding to the level that we actually need higher education as a basic understanding to survive this world successfully. So we need to make that accessible.
And we need accessible, and we need to make it good higher education.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of higher education in this country, too, that's just like
we
not helping.
We need to teach logic.
Yeah.
We had our kids in schools that taught logic, which was really good because it actually made them think and question the bullshit we were teaching them. they were like, you taught me logic. Now I question the idiocy that you're
We're like,
programming me with.
Do your
Mom.
logic homework, but first let's pray illogically to this magical man in the sky. It's mixed messages. Our poor children. But yeah, they had to learn like Latin. They'll tell you horror stories. They'll tell you. We basically put them in a labor camp.
Latin
That's what they
is
see it as.
good for your vocabulary. I do not regret teaching them Latin.
Yeah, because even English.
I don't
Even English
regret
makes more
teaching
sense with
them
Latin.
Latin, logic. I mean, that was excellent.
And science. I mean, there's
I
a
know,
whole bunch of shit.
I regret the religion that I programmed them in. That's all.
No, I'm saying like Latin helps with a lot of
Oh
things.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. It helps the vocabulary in the world because much of the world is rooted in that.
Anyway, somehow we got off on education.
It's important.
Oh, because we're saying that's what I'm saying.
The complex world we live in requires higher education.
Right,
We need to make it accessible.
Here's what I'll say: your little kid does not need to hear that he's the most magical, or she, the most magical creature that's ever touched this planet, because they are not. They're a hairless monkey that needs to be prepared for this world. And I'm tired. This is a rant that I go off a lot on. We are living in the only fucking time in this history of this planet where children are ruling the world, and we're letting them grow up to be privileged idiots. When we need to be teaching them how to think and how to be a part of society in a constructive way and like lend all the wonderful things that make them to the greater scheme of things. But instead, we're teaching them to be these, you're the most important single individual in this world and everyone should fucking just do what you say. Sorry. I get stuck in some places where a kid is, and I like start thinking like,
all right.
Anywho,
I think his rant will end when he has grandkids.
Oh yeah, totally. Well, my grandkids will be better than your fucking kids out there. He'll be the most awesome kid ever. He'll be better than my own kids. I get a redo. I like know something now at this point. The first time you raise kids, you don't know shit. You're just like trying stuff. We like know something now. Learn from our mistakes. But anyway, that's the story of Dungeons and Dragons and how we got real concerned about Satan, getting into us. Satan either abandoned that plan, like I don't know if he just tired and outgrew Dungeons and Dragons, because more people than ever are playing it today.
and the suicides are not.
Yeah,
happening.
and there's no one like losing themselves in the game, and
Yeah.
oh no, my character died. I need to jump out of a window because I can fly. You know, nothing like that happened.
Yeah.
Those were all just stories that were made up, repeated, you know, from people that were claiming to be credible experts. And in the end, it just made us spin our wheels for 2 decades and then move on to something else.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a fun story in the sense that, oh, wow, you can really look at this looking back now. And you can really kind of piece this together. But it's not a fun story because the same kind of shit is happening today in the sense
Yeah.
that there are people on the fringes of our society. Yeah, like, I mean, I'm assuming James Egbert was autistic, or we would at least say he's on the spectrum. Like a kid in the spectrum now who happens to be gay and stuff. That's like no big deal to us
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Right? But there's still tons of people on the fringe. They're just communities, you know, whether it be trans communities or whether, you know, there's a lot of people on the fringe that are demonized, and instead of getting to the root of the problems and helping, you could even say like drug addiction and things too, like instead of getting down to like, this is the problem, let's address the problem, we weave these like supernatural magical things that like, well, Satan's just trying to get us through, you know, and we don't change, we just move on to new things. So this serves as a good example to look back and go like, hey, we do this. We can see when packaged beginning to end, like it ended. It's not still going. You know, it's like, it's a thing we can look at and go, let's not play this pattern out. But, you know, that's why we did it. Just to go, this happened. This is how it went down. Look around, it's happening.
Yeah.
Like, be careful. Don't get sucked into
Don't
bullshit.
get sucked into what's popping up right now.
Yeah. So, cool.
All right.